A teacup meant for comfort, instead carried death. Welcome to WordScript Den. I am your host, Denora. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I can't wait to read your words. Now let's begin. If you've ever spent an afternoon at the brownstone, you'd know it's about as welcoming to disturbances as a church during sermon. Wolfe has his orchids, Fritz has his kitchen, and I have my typewriter and a stubborn streak. Everything runs on rhythm. Which is why when the doorbell rang at 3 o'clock sharp on a Wednesday, I knew it wouldn't be anything good. I opened the door to a man carrying a box the size of a hat case, wrapped too neatly to be casual. He was tall, lean, with the look of someone who'd forgotten how to smile a decade ago. He handed me the box with a kind of finality, like a man delivering not a package but a verdict. "For Mr. Nero Wolfe," he said, and turned on his heel before I could ask what his name was, or if he planned to collect the tip for most abrupt delivery of the year. I set the box on Wolfe's desk, knowing better than to peek. Curiosity and Wolfe's temper mix like oil and flame. 10 minutes later, he waddled in from the plant rooms, wiped his hands on a cloth Fritz had left ready, and eyed the box like it was plotting mutiny. He sat, sighed, and gestured for me to open it. Inside was a porcelain teacup resting in tissue paper, but this wasn't your average dime store china. The thing glowed with delicacy, a pale white flecked with painted violets, and nestled inside it was a note written in an elegant slanting hand, for Nero Wolfe. A matter of taste and of life. I handed the note over. Wolfe read it, grunted, and set it on the blotter without comment. Then he lifted the teacup, squinting at the rim. His lips curled. Bavarian porcelain, 19th century, far too fragile to be burdened with melodrama. He set it down with a clink that made me wince. I said, "If this is someone's idea of fan mail, they've got a strange way of showing appreciation." Wolfe's reply was dry as dust. Appreciation rarely arrives unaccompanied by expectation, and right on cue the bell rang again. This time it wasn't a courier. A woman stepped in, tall, elegant, mid-40s, with eyes that told you she'd never once ordered coffee without someone else paying. She introduced herself as Lydia Caro, voice crisp as cut glass. She saw the teacup on Wolfe's desk and gave a faint nod, as if confirming that her trap had sprung. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "that cup belonged to my sister. She is dead. And before she died, she insisted that if anything were to happen to her, this cup would reveal why." I glanced at Wolfe, expecting him to bark her back out into the street. Instead, he studied her with that half-closed gaze, fingers steepled, face unreadable. He asked, "How did your sister die?" She lowered her voice. "She drank from that very cup. Within the hour, she was gone. The doctors called it a seizure. I call it something else." The air in the office thickened. Wolfe leaned back, frowning. "Archie, bring the sherry." That was Wolfe's way of saying he wasn't dismissing her, not yet. Which meant my rhythm for the day was shot to pieces. And we were about to dive headfirst into another mess, where porcelain and poison went hand in hand. Would you like me to continue directly into Section 2, the brownstone disturbed, next, where Wolfe allows Lydia to tell her full story, and the suspects begin to enter the stage? Lydia Caro accepted the sherry with the composure of someone who expected fine service as her birthright. She didn't sip it at first, just let the glass rest in her hand while her gaze lingered on the teacup, as though it might still hold a trace of her sister's breath. Wolfe waited, silent, eyes half-lidded but sharp. I've seen him sit like that for hours until a client cracks, and Lydia wasn't immune. She began speaking with a deliberate calm that was only barely hiding a tremor underneath. "My sister Margaret was younger than me by 3 years, but she always acted the elder. More cautious, more moral, more—" She paused, choosing the word, judgmental. "For months she'd been saying there was someone in her circle who meant her harm, not physically but reputationally. She never named them, but she hinted often. And then at a tea she hosted last week, she drank from this cup. An hour later she was dead." Wolfe's fingers tapped once on the arm of his chair. "You believe the cup itself was used to deliver poison?" Lydia inclined her head as if the word itself was vulgar but unavoidable. "That is what I believe. She left instructions with me in writing. If anything happened under suspicious circumstances, the cup would be the proof. So I brought it here, because my sister said you were the only man who would see through the fog of polite lies. That was an admission Wolfe couldn't easily ignore, but he wasn't going to jump up and declare himself interested either. Instead, he gave her the flat look he reserves for people who are withholding. "Madam, what you have told me is insufficient. Who was present at this tea?" Lydia's lips tightened, as if she'd known the question was coming and dreaded it. 4 others besides my sister. Dr. Felix Morland, her physician and a family friend. Celia Gray, Margaret's closest companion, though I suspect jealousy colored much of their friendship. Andrew Pierce, a financier who recently lost money in one of Margaret's ventures. And finally, Isabel Lane, a cousin whose ambitions are as sharp as her tongue. Wolfe's brows lifted fractionally, each with opportunity, each with motive, and all shielded by the common cloak of civility. "Archie, you will secure their particulars from Mrs. Carrow. Then you will proceed to test their civility until it frays." I jotted down the names while Lydia, stiff as a marble statue, supplied addresses and short sketches. When she finished, Wolfe leaned forward a fraction, which in his vocabulary is the equivalent of shouting. "Madam, understand me. You have deposited a relic of death into my office. You will now tell me plainly, do you seek the discovery of truth or merely the confirmation of suspicion?" Her eyes flashed, the mask slipping just enough. "Truth, Mr. Wolfe, because if it is what I fear, then I must act." That was enough for Wolfe. He closed his eyes, lips pressed together, and gave the faintest nod. "Archie, the cup is not to be touched until I direct otherwise. Secure it. Then begin with Dr. Morland. Physicians are trained to mask intent, but they are also trained to betray it in their notes and their pride." Lydia rose, drained at last of her earlier poise, and set the empty glass on the table. As she left, I caught the faintest quiver in her hand, a tremor that told me her certainty came less from evidence and more from dread. When the door closed behind her, Wolfe reached for the bell cord and summoned beer. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Archie, porcelain is fragile, but reputations are more so. Someone has used one to shatter the other." I locked the teacup in the safe, though the sight of it still clung to me like a whisper. The brownstone was quiet again, but the kind of quiet that feels temporary, waiting for footsteps that would soon drag its stillness into disarray. Wolfe sat back with his beer, and I knew that whether he admitted it or not, he had already stepped into the game Lydia Carrow had laid at our door. The sanctity of the brownstone was breached once again, and this time by something as delicate and as deadly as a porcelain cup. The next morning I was dispatched to call on Dr. Felix Morland, and I knew before I even rang the bell that Wolfe had picked him first because physicians are a breed with egos as sharp as scalpels. Morland's townhouse was clean enough to eat off the stoop, and the man himself matched the setting. He was late 50s, trim, silver hair brushed back with military precision, and a voice that carried the confidence of someone who had long ago stopped being contradicted. He greeted me with the air of a man doing me a favor simply by existing. When I introduced myself and mentioned Wolfe, his mouth curved in the faintest smile. "Ah, yes, the great detective who never leaves his chair. How quaint." I let that pass with a grin of my own. Sometimes the best way to bait a hook is to let the fish think it's swimming free. We settled into his study, and I asked about Margaret Carrow's death. His response was quick, precise, and almost too neat. It was a seizure, plain and simple. She'd had fainting spells before, and I'd cautioned her about overexertion. Nothing mysterious about it. I leaned back, watching him polish his words like a man polishing silver, each one meant to blind rather than illuminate. "But she left instructions with her sister," I said, suggesting she believed someone intended her harm. That rattled him just enough for a flicker to pass across his face before the calm returned. Patients often dramatize their ailments. Margaret was no different. I let the silence stretch, then asked about the tea. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then shook his head. "Ordinary black tea, nothing unusual." "And the porcelain cup?" His eyes narrowed. "A family heirloom, yes. I handled it myself. Delicate but hardly sinister." I pressed a little harder, pointing out that the timing of her collapse was remarkable. He bristled, voice firming. "Coincidence, Mr. Goodwin, nothing more. But if you intend to chase shadows, then I suggest you look not to medicine, but to those around her who resented her good fortune." That was his first slip. He said it too quickly, too eagerly, as though eager to shove suspicion across the table. I asked him who he meant, and he gave a little shrug, too casual. "Celia Gray has always lived in Margaret's shadow, and Andrew Pierce lost more than money when her investment failed. Ask them." They had reason enough. When I left, he was still standing stiff by the fireplace, jaw tight, like a man who had spoken too much and knew it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened as I gave the rundown. He sat immovable, eyes half closed, fingertips meeting in that cathedral of flesh he builds when he's sorting lies from truth. When I finished, he spoke with a quiet certainty. Morland lies by omission. He knew more of Margaret's health than he revealed. And his eagerness to shift suspicion is the instinct of one who fears examination. I asked if that made him our prime suspect. Wolfe shook his head once, not yet. But the scent of evasion is stronger than the scent of innocence. Tomorrow, Archie, you will see Miss Grey. Envy leaves traces sharper than poison. I didn't argue. When Wolfe starts pairing emotions with toxins, it means he's already convinced the case is a tangle of psychology as much as fact. And I had the feeling Celia Grey would prove more combustible than porcelain if I pressed in the right place. The cup might have been fragile, but the people around it were starting to show the cracks. Celia Grey lived in a converted brownstone on the Upper East Side that looked like it was trying too hard to impress passers-by with polished brass and an unnecessary amount of ivy. The woman herself met me at the door, tall and willowy, with the sort of face that was handsome rather than pretty, and eyes that gave away more than her lips would ever admit. She invited me in with a careful politeness that suggested she didn't want me there, but had been raised to know better than to slam a door. Inside, the place smelled faintly of lilies and expensive perfume, though the rooms carried the clutter of someone who collected fine things, but not quite enough peace to enjoy them. We sat in her parlour, and I asked about Margaret Carrow. The change in Celia was immediate. Her spine stiffened, her voice turned brittle, and her fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. Margaret was a dear friend. I miss her terribly. It sounded rehearsed, like she'd said it in front of mirrors until the cracks smoothed over. I asked about the tea, and she admitted she had been present, her tone sharpening when she added that the gathering had been Lydia's idea, not Margaret's. Margaret despised fuss, but her sister thrived on it. That was the first knife she slipped into the conversation. I steered back to the teacup, asking if she had noticed anything unusual. Her eyes flickered barely but enough, only that Margaret insisted on pouring for herself, which was odd. She never liked to take the trouble. She paused, then added quickly, perhaps she knew she was unwell and wanted no one else to see her hands trembling. It was thin, too thin, like a veil stretched over a hole. I let her sit in the silence before I asked about her own relationship with Margaret. For a moment she forgot to play the grieving friend. Her mouth twisted, her voice dropped. Margaret had everything handed to her. Money, invitations, admiration, and yet she was never content. She had to take what others wanted, just to prove she could. That slip told me more than any denial could. She caught herself, straightened, and added, I say this only because you asked, but if you are hunting for someone who would do her harm, you're wasting your time. Margaret harmed herself every day with her arrogance. I thanked her, stood, and she didn't try to stop me. As I left, I glanced back through the open door and caught her staring into the middle distance, her expression half fury, half grief. Envy and loss make a dangerous cocktail, and she'd been sipping it for years. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened while I relayed the conversation. He grunted once, low in his throat, the way he does when a piece slides into place. Miss Grey resents profoundly, yet resentment alone does not administer poison. Her eagerness to note Margaret's independence at the tea, to insist she poured her own cup, is instructive. It is the kind of detail one emphasizes when one wishes to shift suspicion before it is laid. I asked if that put her ahead of Morland in the running. Wolfe shut his eyes, lips pressed thin. Not ahead, aligned. We now see a pattern, fear from Morland, resentment from Grey, each offers diversion. Together they sketch the outline of intent. He reached for the bell cord, and when Fritz brought in the beer, Wolfe drank deeply, then said, Tomorrow you will see Andrew Pierce. Men who lose money are dangerous, for they believe the world owes them restoration. Observe him closely, Archie. If greed was the hand that held the cup, it will betray itself. I closed my notebook, already picturing another parlour, another story varnished in politeness, another motive hiding beneath the lace. The porcelain teacup sat locked in Wolfe's safe, fragile as truth itself, but the people orbiting it were made of sharper stuff, and the cracks were spreading. Andrew Pierce had the kind of office that announces itself before you even step inside. The secretary wore a smile that had been drilled into place. The carpet was thicker than the wallets of half the city, and the smell of leather and polished wood was strong enough to make you think you'd wandered into a hunting lodge instead of a financier's den. Pierce himself was waiting behind a desk the size of a billiard table, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who has lost fortunes and made them back again without ever admitting weakness. He was broad-shouldered, square-jawed, the type who had been playing rugby in his head long after his knees gave out. When I introduced myself and mentioned Wolfe, he grinned, showing perfect teeth that probably cost more than Fritz's pantry stock. "So Lydia's come running to him, has she?" I should have guessed. That woman never could resist a stage. I kept my own grin in place and asked about Margaret Carrow's tea. His grin faded just a shade, enough to show me the subject wasn't his favorite. Yes, I was there. A dreadful little gathering, really. Margaret never entertained well. She was too fond of subtle insults. I asked him about the collapse. He shrugged like a man dismissing bad weather. Tragic, of course, but not unexpected. She had been under strain. I pressed a little harder, suggesting some believed she had been poisoned. His eyes sharpened for the first time, then narrowed. Nonsense. Margaret was dramatic, always had been. If she left some scribbled warning to her sister, it was more performance than prophecy. That sounded a little too pat, so I shifted to his finances. He leaned back, hands clasped over his chest. Yes, I lost money. Considerable money. But only a fool believes business is riskless. Margaret overreached. I backed her, I lost, and I moved on. If that's a motive, Mr. Goodwin, then every investor in New York is guilty of attempted murder twice a week. The neatness of his words didn't disguise the tension in his jaw. He wanted me to believe he'd shrugged it off, but the kind of man who decorated his office like a battlefield didn't take losses lightly. Before I left, I asked him what he thought of the others present. He gave a laugh, short and bitter. Morland hides behind his medical Latin, Celia pines for a place she'll never have, and Isabel Lane. Well, Isabel is too clever by half. If you're looking for ambition sharpened to a point, look at her. That was his attempt to slide suspicion across the table, same as the others had. When I returned to the brownstone and laid it out for Wolfe, he didn't open his eyes. He only said, "Pierce betrays himself most not by what he admits, but by the ease of his dismissals. Men who claim to move on are often those who cannot." He fears that his loss to Margaret's schemes is seen not as risk, but as failure. And such fear corrodes quickly. I asked if he thought Pierce could have slipped the poison into the cup. Wolfe's lips pressed into a line. Possible, but ambition more often directs the hand than does humiliation. Which is why Miss Lane interests me most. He rang for Fritz and had his beer brought, lifting it like an exclamation mark to his own reasoning. "Tomorrow, Archie, you will go to her. A cousin with sharp ambition at a family table is a blade waiting to be used. Observe her carefully. If the cup was the instrument, then she may have been the hand. I noted it down, though I didn't need reminding. The suspects were circling one another like wolves at the edge of firelight, each pointing inward, each trembling just enough to betray hunger. The porcelain teacup might have been delicate, but the pressure building around it was anything but. The cracks in the surface of civility were spreading wider with every step. Isabel Lane greeted me at her apartment with the kind of poise that tells you she's been rehearsing her entrances for years. She was in her early 30s, striking without being conventionally beautiful, and dressed with the precision of someone who calculated every line and fold for effect. The place was modern, minimalist, as though she wanted the walls themselves to broadcast discipline. She smiled as she let me in, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Lydia Carrow sent you," she said, "not a question but a statement. Or rather, she sent you through Wolfe, which is the same thing." I admitted as much, and she poured herself a drink, not bothering to offer me one. People who don't offer drinks are always trying to remind you whose territory you're on. We sat opposite each other, and I asked her about the tea. She folded one leg over the other and tilted her head, as though considering whether I was worth the effort of a proper answer. It was an unremarkable afternoon, until Margaret made it remarkable. She had a way of turning every gathering into an arena. She poured the tea herself pointedly and served herself first. Then she looked at each of us as if daring us to notice. And within the hour she was gone. Her tone was smooth, almost too smooth, like someone reciting lines written in advance. I asked if she suspected anyone. She laughed softly. All of them. Felix hides behind science because he knows how fragile his authority is. Celia resents because envy is her lifeblood. Andrew lost more than money, he lost face, and men like him don't forgive that. Any one of them might have seized the opportunity. It was a neat little summary, but too neat. She was laying out her competitors like suspects in a parlor game, not friends at a table. I pressed her on her own position, her family connection, her ambitions. She didn't flinch. Margaret liked to remind me that I was younger, less established, dependent. She enjoyed making me small. I have no shame in admitting I wanted more. But ambition is not crime, Mr. Goodwin. Ambition is survival. Her eyes burned as she said it, and for the first time, I saw the steel beneath the polish. I asked her if she knew anything of the cup itself, and there her mask slipped for just a fraction. She looked away too quickly before answering, only that Margaret cherished it, that she kept it apart from the rest. She paused, then added almost casually, she said once that if anything happened to her, that cup would tell the tale. I thought it melodrama. Perhaps I was wrong. When I left, she was still perfectly composed, but I carried the impression of someone who had already prepared her defense long before the charge was made. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened, eyes shut, fingers pressed together like a temple. When I finished, he grunted, "She is dangerous, Archie, not because she lies badly, but because she tells the truth selectively. Ambition cloaked in candor is more potent than venom in porcelain." I asked if he thought she had done it. Wolfe opened his eyes just enough to meet mine. "She is capable, but capability does not prove action. We have now 4 whose motives interlock, like the pieces of a shattered cup. To discover who administered the poison, we must see how they fracture when pressed together." He tugged the bell cord and Fritz arrived with beer. Wolfe drank, set the glass down, and spoke with finality. "We will summon them, all of them, here in this office. The cup is fragile, but truth is more so, and when it cracks, it must be in my presence." That was Wolfe's way of announcing the next act. The brownstone was about to fill with suspects again, and I knew that once Wolfe began pulling their words apart, porcelain wouldn't be the only thing breaking. By the following evening, the brownstone was braced for the storm Wolfe had invited into it. Fritz fussed with the chairs, straightening them in that nervous way he does when strangers are about to invade the sanctity of the office. Wolfe sat behind his desk, like a judge already weary of the trial, his eyes half-lidded, his bulk settled into the red leather chair as if the world had been built to rotate around it. My job was simple. Answer the bell, usher them in, and watch them fray. Dr. Morland arrived first, crisp as pressed linen, but with a touch of sweat at the temples. He gave me a curt nod and moved stiffly to a chair. Pierce came next, broader than the doorway, his handshake too forceful, his grin stretched too wide. Celia Gray slipped in behind him, her face pale, her eyes restless, as if she'd been forced to come but wanted everyone to see her reluctance. And last was Isabel Lane, poised, immaculate, and carrying herself like the entire affair was her stage, and the rest of us were bit players. Once they were seated, Wolfe let the silence hang, that heavy, suffocating quiet he wields like a weapon. Finally he spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "You are gathered here because you were present when Margaret Carrow drank from a cup that became for her a final act. You have each since sought to shift suspicion, onto one another, onto circumstance, onto fate itself. I do not tolerate such evasions." Morland stiffened. Pierce shifted in his seat, Celia's hands twitched in her lap, and Isabel's smile thinned but did not falter. Wolfe continued, his eyes fixed on no one and everyone at once. "The cup is porcelain, fragile. It cannot speak, but it has been made to carry meaning beyond its purpose. That meaning was chosen by one of you and administered with intent." Pierce leaned forward, blustering. "This is nonsense." Margaret collapsed from weakness. "If her sister insists on conspiracies, that's grief-speaking, nothing more." Wolfe turned his gaze on him, calm as stone. "Mr. Pierce, your losses at her hand were public. Your insistence that you have moved on is the very proof that you have not. But your vanity would not permit you to act so crudely." He shifted his gaze without waiting for Pierce's reply. "Miss Gray, you cloak envy and grief, but your words betray you. You wished Margaret diminished, not destroyed. Your bitterness is deep, but it is impotent. She flinched as if struck, color rushing to her cheeks, but she said nothing. Dr. Morland attempted to interject, his voice sharp. "I've already explained it was a seizure." Wolfe cut him off with a lift of his hand. "You, sir, fear exposure. You knew her health. You feared it would reflect upon your competence. But your fear is defensive, not aggressive. You concealed, you did not administer." Finally his gaze settled on Isabel Lane, and for the first time that evening, Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his bulk shifting like a mountain stirring. "You, Miss Lane, speak openly of ambition. You admit grievance, yet present it as virtue. You recite the faults of the others with precision, as though you had prepared the litany. That is the mark not of defense, but of preparation." Isabel's smile did not waver, but her eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me, Mr. Wolfe?" Wolfe closed his eyes, steepled his fingers, and answered with the weight of inevitability. "I do not accuse, I reveal. The poison was subtle, requiring foresight, requiring control of the very vessel she cherished. You knew of her attachment to that cup. You ensured she would use it. And you, Miss Lane, are the one who most benefits from her absence." The silence that followed was different now, taut, dangerous. Isabel's fingers tightened around the armrest, but she said nothing. Wolfe opened his eyes at last, cold and steady. "That, madam, is sufficient." The room pulsed with tension, the air thick enough to slice. I stood by the door ready to usher them out when Wolfe gave the word, knowing the real blow hadn't landed yet. He had pressed them, fractured them, and left the truth hovering. The next move would be the reveal, and I could feel it building like a storm about to break. The silence hung heavy, the kind that makes you hear your own pulse. Wolfe let it stretch until even Pierce shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his bravado leaking out in small fidgets. Celia Gray's fingers worried at the hem of her sleeve, while Morland dabbed at his forehead with his handkerchief, though the room was cool. Isabel alone sat unmoved, her posture regal, her gaze steady on Wolfe as if daring him to push further. When Wolfe finally spoke, it was with that deliberate weight he saves for the moment just before the trap springs. "Miss Lane, you betray yourself not with denial but with silence. The innocent protest. The guilty calculate. You calculate." Her lips curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile, though her eyes flashed. "If I were guilty, Mr. Wolfe, I would hardly have come here tonight." Wolfe opened his eyes fully, sharp as chisels. "You came because you believed your performance would shield you, as it has shielded you before. But ambition, Miss Lane, cannot be hidden by charm. You saw in Margaret not only an obstacle, but an opportunity. By removing her, you inherit her standing in your family's circle." Pierce let out a sharp laugh, bitter and mocking. "Of course it's her. I said as much. She's always had her claws out for advantage." Isabel turned her head slowly toward him, her smile vanishing. "And you, Andrew, have always mistaken your failures for someone else's schemes. You would have done it if you'd had the courage. Celia snapped then, her voice rising sharper than any of us had heard it. "Stop it, both of you. Margaret deserved better than this, even in death." Her eyes glistened, and the mask of envy cracked wide enough to show grief underneath. She turned to Wolfe, pleading. "But I swear I didn't harm her." Wolfe inclined his head once, almost gently. "I have already said you did not. Your resentment was loud, but it lacked direction. You had no plan, only bitterness." Morland, seizing the moment, tried to stand, his voice firming as he declared, "I too have been falsely maligned." "I did nothing." Wolfe's voice cut across him like a knife. "You concealed, Doctor, but you did not kill. Your fear was for your reputation, not for her life. That is cowardice, but not guilt." The words dropped like stones, and the room seemed to shrink. All eyes turned back to Isabel. She remained still, but her jaw tightened and the veneer of calm thinned to the point of transparency. Wolfe leaned back, his great bulk settling deeper into the chair, his voice a final toll of judgment. "You poisoned the tea, Miss Lane. You ensured she would use that particular cup, knowing her attachment to it. And you relied upon the silence of these others, each compromised by their own flaws, to shield you." Isabel's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting second, the mask shattered. The silence that followed was no longer uncertainty. It was the sound of four people realizing the truth had been laid bare. I watched Wolfe close his eyes, steeple his fingers, and breathe out through his nose, satisfied. The room was still, but the weight had shifted. The cracks in their stories had split wide, and Isabel Lane was left alone at the center. The teacup sat locked in the safe upstairs, but the real evidence was already scattered across the faces in that office. Wolfe opened his eyes again, cold and final. "That is all. Archie, you may show them out." I knew then the case wasn't about porcelain or poison anymore. It was about ambition sharpened too fine, and a woman who believed she could sip from her cousin's life and leave nothing behind but a fragile, deadly cup. I moved to the door, but none of them rose at first. They sat frozen, as if Wolfe's words had nailed them to their chairs. Finally, Moreland stood bristling, his voice high and tight. "If this is your judgment, then I demand it be recorded. I will not have my name smeared by association." Wolfe didn't bother opening his eyes. "Sit down, Doctor. Your reputation is already tarnished by your evasions. You compound it with hysteria." Moreland sat, cheeks flushed crimson, and the office was silent again. Pierce leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair as if he wanted to rip them out. "So what happens now? Do we hand her over to the police? Or does this circus just disperse and leave Margaret to rot without justice?" His eyes flicked to Isabel, whose stillness was more dangerous than any outburst. She met his glare calmly, her voice low. "Careful, Andrew. If you cry wolf too loudly, you'll find yourself in the trap instead." Celia let out a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "You're all mad. Margaret is dead, and we're sitting here tearing each other apart like she would have wanted." She looked at Wolfe then, desperate. "If you truly believe it was Isabel, then stop playing games and say it plainly." Wolfe opened his eyes, heavy and sharp as chisels. "I have said it. But the law requires more than truth. It requires proof. The proof lies in the cup. The residue can be found if one knows where to look. But I need not soil my hands with laboratory trifles. The psychology is enough. Isabel Lane had motive, opportunity, and foresight. The others had grievances, but she had design." Isabel's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, not quite defiance. "Then you admit you cannot prove it?" Wolfe's tone hardened. "I require no proof for myself, madam. But you will find that your circle will be less forgiving. They have seen your silence, your calculation, your ambition. That is more damning than any residue in porcelain." The room seemed to fold in on itself. Moreland shifted uneasily. Pierce muttered something under his breath, and Celia stared at Isabel with open loathing. For the first time, a crack appeared in Isabel's poise. Her eyes flicked, quick and sharp, toward the safe where the teacup rested unseen. It was the smallest betrayal, but in Wolfe's office, the smallest betrayal is enough. Wolfe closed his eyes again, satisfied. "You have betrayed yourself, Miss Lane. That will suffice." I cleared my throat, ready to end it before the air strangled us all. I ushered them out one by one, each leaving with a different weight. Moreland with indignation, Pierce with bitterness, Celia with grief, and Isabel with that dangerous calm that told me this wasn't the last she'd simmer over it. When the door shut behind the last of them, the brownstone exhaled its silence again. I turned to Wolfe, who hadn't moved, his eyes closed, his fingers resting lightly against each other. "So I asked, that's it? We let her walk?" Wolfe's lips curved in the faintest grimace. "She is already condemned, Archie. Ambition has betrayed her, and society will finish the task. No court is needed when reputation is the gallows." He reached for his beer, Fritz arriving as if summoned by the words themselves. Wolfe drank deeply, then set the glass down with finality. Margaret Carrow died because envy, greed, fear, and ambition gathered at her table. One hand administered the poison, yes, but all of them contributed to the cup. That, Archie, is the true verdict. I scribbled it in my notebook, though I didn't need the reminder. The case had closed not with handcuffs or headlines, but with Wolfe's words pressing down like stone. The teacup might remain locked in the safe, but its work was done. The sanctity of the brownstone had been disturbed, tested, and restored again, leaving only the faint clink of porcelain in my memory, and Wolfe's quiet judgment hanging in the air like the final toll of a bell. Dinner that night felt heavier than usual. Though Fritz had outdone himself with duck in orange glaze and a soufflé that deserved applause, Wolfe ate with his usual solemnity, methodical and deliberate, as though nothing outside the dining room had ever existed. I picked at my plate, waiting for him to break the silence, but he didn't. When we returned to the office, he settled into the red leather chair, pulled a fresh beer toward him, and let out a sigh that wasn't quite satisfaction. I leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "So we let Isabel walk out of here with nothing more than your words hanging over her." "You sure that's enough?" Wolfe closed his eyes, his voice deep and steady. "Enough for me. The law will not touch her, Archie, but society will. In her circle, suspicion is contagion. She will find doors closed, invitations rescinded, alliances withered. She will learn that reputation once cracked never mends. I snorted. That's justice in the parlor game sense. What about Margaret? She's still dead, and her sister's still sitting somewhere waiting for a verdict that never quite comes wrapped in paper. Wolfe opened his eyes, a glint of irritation surfacing. You mistake me. My task is not vengeance nor consolation. It is revelation. Margaret Caro was destroyed not by one hand alone, but by the interplay of many weaknesses. Fear, envy, greed, ambition. The cup was merely the vessel. What killed her was human folly, and that has been exposed. The word sat between us like a stone. I thought about Celia's brittle grief, Pierce's clenched jaw, Morland's sweat, and Isabel's poised silence. Each of them guilty in their own way, each carrying a shard of responsibility. Even if only one had slipped the poison into the tea. Wolfe was right as usual, though I wasn't about to tell him. Some truths don't land like thunder. They settle, slow and heavy, and you don't shake them off easily. Fritz entered to clear the glasses, and the clink of porcelain against silver made me glance instinctively toward the safe where the teacup lay. Fragile, harmless now, yet it had carried more weight than steel. Wolfe noticed my glance and gave a small grunt. Lock it away until Lydia Caro reclaims it. She will treasure it as relic, but it is nothing more than a shard of porcelain. Its true work is finished. I nodded, though the sight of it still hovered in my mind. I couldn't help thinking that Isabel Lane would go on with her sharp smile, carving out her place in the world, carrying the guilt like a hidden jewel. Maybe Wolfe was right. Society would choke her slowly. Or maybe she'd thrive in the shadows, untouched by anything but her own ambition. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing again, his voice a low rumble. Archie, men deceive with words, women with silence, but both reveal themselves by what they cannot relinquish. Margaret's cup was her vanity, Isabel's her ambition. They broke her as surely as poison. That is the lesson. I jotted it down in my notebook, though the weight of it didn't need ink to last. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent, but in the brownstone the case had settled into its usual end. Wolfe with his philosophy, Fritz with his cooking, and me with my notes. Order restored for now, until the next fool decided to disturb the peace with some new fragile relic, carrying death in its shadow. Now generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective style. The following afternoon, Lydia Caro returned to the brownstone, her poise intact, but her eyes rimmed with the wear of sleepless hours. She sat across from Wolfe, hands folded tightly in her lap, and asked the question she'd been carrying since she first stepped into our office. Is it resolved? Wolfe didn't bother with preamble. It is resolved enough. Your sister's death was no accident. The poison was placed in the tea, and it was ensured she would drink from that particular cup. The one responsible was Isabel Lane. Lydia's lips parted, but no sound came at first. Then she whispered, "My cousin." Wolfe inclined his head, his voice calm but sharp. Ambition drove her. The others were compromised by envy, by greed, by fear. But only Miss Lane had the design and the resolve. She intended to inherit what Margaret denied her. She chose subtlety, but her very calculation betrayed her. Lydia sat very still, absorbing the words. When she spoke again, her tone carried a mix of bitterness and relief. Will she be punished? Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, his head tilting back against the chair. Punishment comes in many forms, madam. The law may not touch her, but reputation will. In her world, suspicion is as lethal as any verdict. She will find no peace, no trust, no doors open to her. I watched Lydia's hands tighten further, the knuckles white. It wasn't vengeance she wanted. Not exactly, but justice of some sort. And Wolfe had delivered it in the only coin he traffics in, truth, unvarnished and immovable. She rose slowly, her composure stitched back in place. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. You've given my sister the clarity she deserved. When she left, Wolfe shifted, grunting as he reached for his beer. He drank deeply before speaking again. Archie, people imagine justice as retribution. It is not, it is exposure. Strip away the disguises and leave a man or a woman naked before their own motives. That is all. I closed my notebook, watching the steam rise from Fritz's preparations in the kitchen. The brownstone was settling back into its rhythm, its silence, its sanctuary. The porcelain cup still lay locked in the safe upstairs, harmless now yet heavy with the memory of the ambition it carried. Wolfe leaned back, satisfied, and I gave him my usual parting shot. So all it takes to ruin a life is one fragile teacup. He opened his eyes just enough to glare. Fui! It is not the cup, Archie. It is the hand that lifts it and the folly that drives it. That was Wolfe's final word, and dinner was ready. Order restored, case closed, truth delivered, and me? I filed it away with all the other stories I'd seen unfold in that office. A reminder that in Wolfe's world, people break more easily than porcelain, and nothing fragile ever survives ambition.